Hi, I'm Ibada Wadud, and I'm super excited to be here with all of you. Welcome to my course, Equity-Centered Design and Design Justice. Greetings to everyone across the globe. I know some of you, it's very early. I know that for some of you, it's very late. For those of you who are just joining, I am in New York City, in Queens. I live in Far Rockaway. I'm a designer and an educator and a social entrepreneur. And I've been working in sustainability for a decade. And that was before there was any hashtag sustainability, any buzz about sustainability at all. Before there was really sustainability was acknowledged as a sector or a discipline or a practice that was applicable to industries, and particularly commerce and particularly fashion. So to see how sustainability has evolved within the industry over the last 10 years for me is absolutely remarkable. The Open EDU initiative is something that feels very much like it resonates with my work. The fact that it is an equity-centered approach and that it centers Black, Indigenous, people of color, and ethnic minority educators, and that we are particularly focused on ensuring that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are able to access this course for free is something that is extremely important to me, and the values that really define my practice as a design justice educator. Within the field of design, it is really important to note that our intentions, whether we are, professional designers or new to the field of design, are only as great as the rigor of our practices. So we are always accountable as designers for the outcomes of our work. If the outcome is pain, it is by design. If the outcome is joy, it is by design. So a skilled designer, and more importantly, a rigorous who holds themselves to a certain standard, is able to observe and notice and reflect on their power and privilege in order to actively work to dismantle oppressive systems, and while acknowledging that those systems are by design. And therefore, the really good news is that liberation and equity can also be built by design, right? And so that's why we're here. How do we get there? I think all of you, or many of you, I'll say, are potentially familiar with something called human-centered design. Human-centered design is an approach to problem solving that's commonly used in design and management frameworks, including across, corporate industries. And it develops solutions to problems by involving the problem-solving process, right? And the steps, quote unquote, although we're going to go into this, this is not a linear process. Empathy, define, right? So we empathize, we define, we ideate, we prototype, we test, and we iterate. And it is a cycle, right? And it's not linear. And so these are the core elements of human-centered design. Now, human-centered design is a great foundation to approach any type of endeavor in which we are seeking out to achieve a more equitable outcome. However, equity-centered design, we have to be extremely, again, intentional about our approach. And so now we are looking at equity-centered design and design justice as a new and emerging lens for work across the industry, right? In order to foster liberation and in order to foster justice. So in this class today, we will learn that systemic oppression is built into our daily life beyond individual acts. It affects everything we do, which is why we are really zooming out and really approaching this with broad strokes, right? It affects everything we do: learning, leading, teaching, designing, improving. So when we relate oppression singularly to individual and interpersonal actions, we're actually failing to notice that it's systems instructions at scale and by design, and how we benefit from them, whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage, right? And also how we are harmed by them. Sasha Costanza-Chalk, who's an associate professor at civic media at MIT, says in her book, Design Justice, what is the relationship between design, power, and social justice? Design justice is an approach to design that is led by marginalized communities and that aims explicitly to challenge rather than reproduce structural inequalities. It has emerged from a growing community of designers in various fields who work closely with social movements and community-based organizations around the world. And so when we look at this, right, we are really centering those who are most marginalized, communities that are most marginalized, to challenge rather than reproducing the same outcomes, whether desired, whether intentional or unintentional. And so we're going to use the lens of human-centered design and equity-centered design to really understand how we can foster, right, and serve as conduits for equity and justice as designers. What's really important to understand is that design is a social practice, right? That is a fundamental element of human-centered design. We are a diverse group of co-creators. We're here from all over the world. And in our diversity, we're able to respond to unmet needs, what I call unmet needs, or what you might know as design challenges, in order to foster a liberating experience for any end user, right? That could be a customer, or that could be someone receiving a service. Historically, we've observed that this type of design practice is effective. And when we look at the history of human-centered design, or as some of you might know it as design thinking, we really start to notice that the greatest innovators of our time shared a very common approach. They each developed a deep understanding of their users' lives and unmet needs. And later design thinking emerged within this century and was branded. It really sought to sort of package and market the design process in order to illustrate how designers and non-designers can be more effective in their responses to the pain points of the human experience, the pain points of our society. And so that is why, as designers, I say that we strive to liberate the user. So a fundamental principle of equity-centered design and design justice is that any system produces what it was designed to produce. Meaning, again, back to where we started, whether it's intentional or unintentional, the outcome is by design. And so equity and design are interrelated because regardless of what you intend or don't intend, the outcome has the potential to help or to harm. And so we're always seeking as designers to liberate or quote unquote help. And so what frameworks can we use to ensure that we are closer, as close as possible, right, to that desired outcome? First of all, we're going to take a stab at reclaiming design. Design is not only a practice, and it's not only an industry, it's a discipline. And this is an open education, public education initiative. And so I think it's really important to talk about how we learn and how we define knowledge. When we allow biased institutions to define knowledge, or more specifically, institutional knowledge, at the systemic level, we often end up oppressing those who we intend to uplift. And sometimes we even do this on purpose by designing systems that support and reinforce and reproduce individual biases that we hold: racism, sexism, classism, ableism. These biases are largely based on how we are socialized and subsequently what we come to value as knowledge. When we benefit from oppression, which we call privilege, we are more likely to design for oppression. Although this is a challenging notion, right? This is the rigor. This is exactly the rigor and the standard to which we must hold ourselves as designers. We are observing our places in society, and we're beginning to notice that oppression is pervasive. And so what do we do about that? When it's built into our daily life, beyond individual acts, it affects everything we do. I think first we have to have an understanding as a community in this class today about what systemic oppression really is and what it means. So as you can see, there's some phenomena playing out at each level. On an individual level, we're looking at identity and difference, and individual advantage and disadvantage, and explicit and implicit bias, and internalized oppression. Interpersonally, we may be looking at systemic oppression and examples of that: race interactions, microaggressions, transferred oppression, institutionally, right? So for example, in our hospitals, right, within our medical systems, in our universities, in our public elementary schools, we're looking at how biased policies and practices, everything from hiring to teaching, even to parenting and family dynamics, and how institutional biases are policing our interactions day to day. And also the disproportionate outcomes and experiences at an institutional level. Structurally, we're noticing that systems of advantage and disadvantage and how these affect and interact and accumulate across institutions and across history. And we're also looking at societal history of oppressive practices and policies. So to reconcile our intention versus the outcome of our intention, we have to intentionally and continuously seek out perspective. I remember in those first 5 minutes, as we were all introducing ourselves and saying where we're from, someone said they were here to gain perspective, right? So that is absolutely core to design justice as a practice and as a framework. We are intentionally and continuously seeking out perspective, because our unconscious biases, no matter what they are, skew our perspective. And so to restore balance, we can continuously seek to notice, which is a core element of equity-centered design. We have to notice our relationship to power and how it motivates our choices as designers. How did we receive this power? Was it inherited? Is it merited? Or is it the merit of our power that's rooted in injustice? For example, how did you advance through oppressive systems? Did you work 3 times as hard to earn a scholarship? Did you have proximity to power? How did you receive access to the privileges that you have? And so we now know that we are challenging the notion of our knowledge to arrive at new ways of knowing and designing and making. And we're also learning that what we know is a product of who we are, right? What we know is a product of who we are. And so informed designers are equipped with the tools to reconcile that. And so we're going to begin to frame our learning experience through the lens of equity-centered design with the understanding that this is a product of institutional knowledge. And we understand that as collaborators, we have the space to kind of prod at the knowledge that I'm presenting to you. And so even though this is a product of an institution, right, and that institution is part of a system that is inherently and systemically oppressive, we are opening up a window through communication and through dialogue to sort of check ourselves, right? And really hold ourselves accountable, not only to ourselves, but to each other. So we are moving on, and we're going to look at dilemma of habit. And so as you can see, the design opportunity when it comes to design justice and equity-centered design lies within this intersection and this overlap of equity work and design work, where equity work often lacks an intentional and powerful approach to design and creativity, or we could call it social justice work, we could call it sustainability work. Design can often fail to address root causes of inequity. And then, as we have discussed, can reproduce inequitable power relationships. So the reason why it's really important to look at the intersection of equity and design is because that is where the opportunity for innovation exists for us. And so the design dilemma of habit, which fails to sort of address some of these root causes of inequality, is supported by the sustainability work centered in social justice, that's centered in equity. So we call this the equity dilemma of habit and the design dilemma of habit. Diversity and inclusion certainly foster equity, and they're indispensable to the design process because they allow designers to find perspective through context and offer diverse lenses for knowing and learning. So as social practitioners, we're going to explore historical, cultural, social, economic, and environmental lenses, all of this through those lenses. And this interdisciplinary approach provides us with unique insights that help us to better understand society's pain points, which again, ultimately that is the designer's role, that is the designer's function, that is the designer's contribution. To be a little bit more concrete, right? Let's talk about scenarios. We can imagine beautiful things and we can realize our visions in a vacuum sometimes as designers, right? And so topical design, right, which that's what we call topical design, can sometimes be harmful and even create a lot of waste or harm, right? We might say, oh, this is really beautiful and it's a great concept and I want to realize this vision, right? But we haven't thought about, for example, the community that we are working with or working within, who our end user is, what their unmet needs are. We haven't necessarily empathized, right, with that community. And therefore, we're not necessarily going to be effective in our role as designers. This dilemma of habit is really important to acknowledge so that we're able to reconcile the harmful outcomes of our actions when we do sometimes stumble and design topically and reinforce that status quo. And so a human-centered designer or an equity-centered designer knows that as long as you stay focused on the people you're designing for and listen to them directly, you can arrive at optimal solutions that meet their needs. So the ECD framework is a remix of the human-centered design framework. So if you remember, there were 6 elements of the human-centered design framework, which was that first slide that we looked at. And what was missing? So the ECD framework asks us to acknowledge our power. And in doing so, what was missing from the human-centered design framework was noticing, right? Acknowledging our power and how that influences design, not only as a practice, but also as a discipline and how we're educating the next generation of designers, which is critical for sustainability. And then what it also does is it asks us to reflect. Before we say, oh, okay, we're going to prototype this product again, or we're going to make a new collection and design into a new collection, we are reflecting and we're looking at the outcomes. And we're saying, okay, is this getting us a little bit closer to the equitable outcome that we intended? Oh, no, actually, the outcome is something that we didn't intend. Okay, before we design into and utilize more resources that will certainly reproduce the same outcome, let's take a step back and ask ourselves how we can approach this differently. And so as designers, we observe and acknowledge in order to reveal opportunities for liberation. Although you might see the steps, so to speak, or the elements, as I like to call them, of the equity-centered design framework as a step-by-step process, it is not a linear process. This is a completely non-linear process, right? And that's the beauty of the process, right? We're always going back, we're always revisiting, we're prototyping, and then we're going back to test, and then we're noticing something new, and we're going back again to prototype, and then we're implementing something new, a new development, right? And seeing, ooh, does this produce a different outcome? Okay, great, it does. And we're going back and we're empathizing with the community, and perhaps we're interviewing to say, okay, what do you think of this outcome? And then we're going back again, right? And that's why the empathy element is so critical, because there does have to be this element of this very human element of forgiveness, right? In order to continue, in order to succeed. Forgiveness for, that was a really frustrating mistake that I made. How did I miss that? Why didn't I talk to this person or this community before I tested this prototype? And now I've wasted a bunch of resources and I have to start again. But that is the design process, right? That is core to design. And when we're going through the motions and we're saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I did it, done. That's not rigorous. We can call that design, and we can say, okay, you know, I have a physical output, right? But what did that design process look like? And what were the checks and balances? And that's really what the design justice framework presents, right? It presents a more equitable way to produce outcomes that universally as designers, we understand are critical for an effective practice. It is super messy, super scary, but that's what it's all about. And so it really requires vulnerability. It really requires empathy. It requires forgiveness. These are, I want to say, almost spiritual elements, right? And this is where it becomes really, really exciting because we start to see the connection that is so deeply rooted as it relates to design and sustainability in Indigenous memory and in Indigenous knowledge. We can go to the next slide. So that is the noticing element of the process, right? Courage, sense of humor, a willingness to look foolish, all are elements, right? Love and humility are all human elements that are required for this work that we're doing together. In closing, we can say that what is really design justice and equity-centered design is really a practice that when implemented and when practiced over and over and over again, right? Like anything, right? It requires lots and lots of practice. It becomes something that then is able to replicate itself, and by design is able to become viral in the way that it creates positive impact, whether that's positive environmental impact, positive social impact. When we use an equity-centered approach, right, and one that is rooted in social justice, environmental justice, liberation, we're actually doing that by design in a way in which that is the roadmap for the success of the overall work that we're doing, right? So the sustainability and the social justice element isn't an add-on. It's not a nice to have. It's not an addendum. It's not, one approach through which we can view design and industry and commerce, right? It's the most rigorous way in which we can do so. And when we do that, right, when we hold ourselves to that standard and we strive for excellence in that way, then we're actually designing models and frameworks and methodologies, right, and systems and building structures that are able to dismantle harmful systems, harmful structures, and replace those systems and structures and models with ones that are able to sustain themselves, right? That is the fundamental premise of design justice, in that the social element is the roadmap for profitability within the commerce industry, within the fashion industry, within the beauty industry. And so that is core to this notion, is that the sustainability element and the social justice element is the roadmap for the economic prosperity, for the social prosperity, for the environmental prosperity. All of these things are able to coexist when we center equity. And so as we do so, we get closer and closer, and it never, never ends. And that's the exciting part, you guys. It never, never ends, but we get closer and closer every day, right? Every project, every class that in which we are actively and intentionally practicing this work, we get closer and closer to a practice that feels rooted in equity and liberation. I'm going to just, in closing, say that as you notice and as you reflect, you're thinking about how we define problems versus how we respond to unmet needs, and you're noticing this difference, and it's part of the unlearning and the reclaiming of design. I want you to just think about how you personally, within your own design practice, within your own work, whether you identify as a designer or as a non-designer, how can design and design justice influence your work and your design practice to foster equity, and how can you personally serve as a conduit for that? What are the values in your practice as it relates to your work? And that is the acknowledgement. That's the acknowledgement of our power, our identity, and the context of how we've obtained that power and how we have come to identify our identities as who we are individually as human beings. And so the reveal is your authentic self, and the opportunity, once we acknowledge my authentic self, my core values, my design practice, and its relationship to society, and we're able to say, okay, now I have an opportunity. Now I have an opportunity right? Just the opportunity to say, okay, now that I have acknowledged my power, my privilege, the systemic biases, the structural biases at a systemic level, now I have just an opportunity. We're literally opening the door and walking through and stepping through for the first time. Now I have an opportunity to liberate based on the decision of one person, one white male, designed a 2-track educational system. And one was for the laboring and one was for the learned. And we are forever indebted to Thomas Jefferson for the invention of a classist private and public education system. He says that, will allow a few of the laboring class to advance by raking a few geniuses from the rubbish. And thus, scholarships were born, right, as part of our education system. We like to think, oh, wow, yeah, scholarships, awesome. Yes, we should have scholarships. Great, yes, really good, really good. Scholarships are a product and an output of an inherently and intentionally discriminatory, biased, and oppressive education system that was intentionally designed to have 2 tracks, one for privileged people and one for people who were laborers. So even in our society, within the education systems that we are learning today, the institutional knowledge that we have adopted and that we've internalized, right, at an individual level, at a professional level, at a personal level, is so deeply rooted in our systems that it is still impacting how we learn, how we educate, how we teach today. And we have not redesigned that system. So, that is really a really great way for us to sort of close out this conversation, to really look at our systems and say, how was this designed? Who designed it? Why was it designed this way? And is it continuing to serve us today? And if not, what am I doing personally if I am qualified to do so? And if my lived experience affords me the opportunity to do so, what am I doing to contribute to a more equitable system? Ultimately, it is through diverse and inclusive environments, not in a vacuum, intentionally collaborating, particularly, again, back to where we began, with those communities that have been most marginalized by design, that we are able to achieve this rigorous practice that we call design justice, which I like to just call design. Thank you. So I'm going to pop over in the chat and look at any questions that already are there. Can you repeat the name of the book, please? Yes, with pleasure. It is called Design Justice. It is by Sasha Costanza Chalk. Can you give an example of what has been designed to liberate? Let's use a very tangible, concrete example, like a product, right? So I'll give you an example. There was a design firm that noticed, wow, we went to South Africa and noticed that the impact of women carrying water barrels on their heads was impacting many aspects of their lives, including their physical health and also their ability to access, I would say, their economic mobility, right? Their ability to have additional time in the day to do other things versus carrying water. And they said, simple, we'll just design a barrel that rolls, right? And you can look it up. It was called the hippo roller. The hippo, like the animal, the hippo roller. Great, we'll design this barrel. You can roll it. It holds more water. Wonderful, great intentions. Culturally appropriate. So, okay, here I am. I'm a mother. I am now using the hand that I would need to carry my child to carry a barrel versus freestanding barrel on my head, carrying baby, and probably a couple of other things that are necessary throughout the day. So designed to liberate, but did it? And the answer was no. So again, that's the reconciliation of intention versus outcome that is critical to design justice. Do you have any insight as to why so few designers use design thinking? My insight, acknowledging that, it's based on my experience, which is inherently, biased. But my insight is that we've sort of collectively gotten away from the core principles of design as a society. And why? Because we and our work are products of society, right? And so when everything's moving super fast, when everyone wants everything instantly, right? Like all of these things that are really centered in a capitalist value system, right? A lot of times that's again, topical design, beautiful, cool, awesome, looks good. Oh, more waste. Oops. But it looks good and it'll sell. Okay, cool. And then we design and we do that again and again. And we've gotten a bit away from the really fundamental principles of design and that rigor, again, that I referred to in the beginning of the class. So why do so few designers use design thinking? I'm not sure that it's that they're noticing that necessarily and then actively choosing to not reference human-centered design, or even more specifically, an equity-centered approach to human-centered design and design in general. I think it's just that as a society across industries, and design is a great example, we've gotten away from ourselves a bit, right? And so we are returning to the principles of indigeneity, right? And now we're noticing, oh shit, equity matters. And we can't just choose it sometimes. Next question. How do you manage leading while also being a part of the problem? I have clearly benefited from the system more than others as a white woman, but also feel like I want to push to change the system. This is why it's really important to go back to the human element, right? Because we're looking at ourselves individually as human beings and our identity as individuals. We're noticing and we're observing and we're acknowledging our bias and our privilege and how we got where we are and what we know and what we don't know and what we have and what we don't have. And it's not to say that there are certain things that and certain opportunities that as a white woman, for example, right? Or as a Black woman, for example, that are examples of things that maybe I couldn't specifically push to change, or you couldn't specifically push to change. I think it's much more about collectively acknowledging the systemic nature of inequity and working in whatever capacity that you have as an individual, right? Not seeking to emulate, for example, the capacity that someone else has. That's not your lived experience. Your lived experience is your lived experience. And so you have to have that conversation, right? Again, within this context of design and design justice, we're having these conversations with ourselves. And we're saying, okay, how can I personally add value? Right. And so that is really important. It relates very much to your experience. It relates very much to your identity. But that alone doesn't qualify us or disqualify us. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge. Do you have any insight on how we can find experts in equity and design? For example, are there nonprofits that you recommend? The Slow Factory. Like, hit us up, guys. Hit up all of the instructors that are a part of this series. And I personally will love to hear from you. I know that it may take some time to probably answer any follow-up questions individually, but please feel free to email me. Also, I think that just core fundamental books and resources that magnify, amplify the Black, Indigenous, and ethnic minority experience that has been marginalized, right? Can you elaborate on moving towards action and liberation? Absolutely. And the question says, I personally tend to get stuck in the noticing part and get paralyzed by the acknowledgement of my privileges. which tends to make me feel like I better just always leave, not design, because I could only create based on oppression and privilege. I understand that fear and that anxiety, and I understand that that's very overwhelming. It sort of goes back to that slide. That was the, oh my gosh, that's hecka white male, fuck this, right? Frustration, confusion. I get stuck all the time. And I like to go back to remind myself of, again, my individual contribution that I am able to add versus what someone else is able to add. We all have something special to add and contribute, and that is our unique way that we can add value. And it requires courage and self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others and all of those things, right, that we saw in the slides and that we talked about. But I certainly wouldn't give up because we need you. And especially someone who's willing to say that and say, what can I do? We need you desperately. How do you keep your core value of community and voicing your perspective and comments on the design process when you're left feeling like you were traumatized within that experience? I don't know exactly how to answer that question. I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question for you, but I am qualified to answer that question for myself. It took me a very long time, but I transitioned out of those environments, out of the spaces in which I felt like sustainability was being misappropriated and intentionally and unintentionally abused. For me, it was really important to say, how can I do this work in a way that is most authentic to myself, my experience, my identity, in a way where I can add value, and also where I won't be harmed in the process, and continue to do the work that I love and that I think I'm pretty good at. We've got 2 minutes, and I want to use those 2 minutes to say thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who got up today and joined me. You did not have to be here, and I am so grateful. I could nearly drop a little single tear. This journey is so personal for me and so important, I think, to the future of design and the future of sustainability. I really look forward to the flurry of emails that I'm expecting. Please send them my way. I will go one by one and respond to you. And I think that that is everything on my end. Thank you again so much for being here. Just by virtue of being here, you are all remarkable, amazing human beings. And I am really excited to see what we can all produce collectively together by design in order to liberate ourselves and others and build a more sustainable future for ourselves on this beautiful planet that we call Earth. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.